We're being live streamed also.
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this HEC Paris virtual conference room for our HEC webinar. When joining this conference, you will notice that your microphones have been switched off because of the webinar format of this event. You will, however, be able to ask questions and make comments using the Q&A menu that you will find at the bottom of your window in your Zoom toolbar. The speakers will only answer questions and read comments sent through the Q&A menu and will not be taking any questions coming from the chat. Please be aware that questions in the Q&A menu can be upvoted by clicking on the thumbs up icon and thus prioritized on the speaker's dashboard. Make sure that you keep the chat for technical questions to our team only. We would like to remind you that this webinar is also broadcasted on HEC Paris YouTube channel. We will now begin, and I'll leave the floor to Michael Segala to introduce the guest for today. Michael?
Thank you very much. Welcome here, everybody. We'll put on the screen. Let me click on here to do it correctly. Just a little bit of the rules so you remember that, visualize it on that. And let's go ahead and get ourselves started. There we go. I'm Michael Segala, Professor Emeritus here at HEC and partner of the International Board Foundation in Zurich, Switzerland. And what we're interested this year is on this whole issue of digital ethics. You've all been reading the press, I'm sure, about all the sort of disasters that have been going on. And so we wanted to get some data about that. So we surveyed the SEMS network, which is about 12,000 people, and the HEC social network, so which is another 30 or 40,000 nowadays, in order to collect some information about digital ethics. And so what I want to do, first of all, is just to show you 4 slides about the results of that study, and then introduce our expert panel speakers who are going to speak to that and about what their companies are doing about digital ethics. So let me show you with the first slide right away here. And what you see on this slide is who responded to our study. Okay, so the responses you see here, which I'm very happy to see, is that we have lots of middle managers responding, lots of senior managers, board of directors, C-level executives, owners, entrepreneurs, vice presidents, etc. So we have a very top-heavy response panel. So we should be getting some interesting and good data about this. And remember this top-heaviness because when you have a lot of the senior management, they're supposed to know how the organization is working. So we'll see, maybe that's a little bit interesting question to dig into. Particularly here, one of the questions was, are you requiring authorization when you use big data with artificial intelligence or machine learning, ML? And what you see here is that 31% of the companies said, yes, our company, if we're using any company data, we need to get authorization from somebody, okay? Yes, 28%, but only if it's personally identifiable data. If it's not personally identifiable, it's differently. Down at the bottom, maybe people don't know, and at the bottom of 19%, no, they don't need that. So what's interesting about this is first, nearly 20% of the companies don't need any authorization at all to use this data. Secondly, and for a senior level, there's a lot of maybes there. It'd be nice to know if the maybes were from the junior level or senior level. Maybe it's not been well publicized in the firm yet that these digital advisory boards or institutional review boards are available. Maybe they simply don't know at this particular point. So it's a question that's interesting to look at. Finally, who reviews? If you have to have a review, who does it? And again, overwhelming the majority is they're not certain who does it, which means internally the information is not being distributed. Next highest one is no one does it, okay? Then you get to the IT department, and I don't want to embarrass Adrian here, but Adrian, if I asked you something about ethics, would you have any training in that?
No.
Okay, so how is your IT department supposed to answer questions on digital ethics, okay? Compliance managers, we'll talk a little bit later on. The compliance is not the same as ethics. Compliance is it legal or not? Ethics is a different question. The legal department probably is where the compliance manager lives. And then fewer people all the way down the line here. So it's not clear, that there's a consistent policy across firms. And then finally, we have, what's the state of digital ethics advisory panels? And many of the respondents said, our company is currently considering establishing one, okay, 7%. 16% of the companies said we already have one. And from my internal look at the data, these were mostly companies that were American companies, and the respondents were here in France working. And so their American companies are beginning to have them at a faster rate than European companies. Many of them said, yeah, we should have them. Yes, we should have them. And 30% said, no, we should not have them. So a goal of our seminar here is to turn those no's into yeses and turn those yeses into getting it done. Because if a company doesn't have these advisory panels, they're likely to not only get in trouble with GDPR, but they're likely to get in trouble with their own consumers and own employees and their whole ecosystem. So that was the results of that. And then we want to talk about that from not from an academic perspective, but from a practical real world perspective. And so let me introduce to you our speakers today. The panelists are really happy to have them come on board with us. We have Caroline here, head of HR and communications at Société Générale, one of the largest banks in France and Europe, certainly. Caroline's on the executive committee there, and so she carries two hats with her, head of HR and head of communications, and both those are beginning to use a lot of social media, a lot of big data. So she's going to have some interesting things to tell us about that. Then we have Kourosh coming on, who is Senior Vice President at Henkel Adhesive Technologies in Germany. He's an alumni of the SEMS Community of European Management Schools, which we called it at that time, University of Cologne, and at HEC. And he's on the SEMS Strategic Board. And he's right now involved at Henkel in trying to forward the transformation of their digital policies right now. I'm sure he's going to be able to have some very interesting things to tell us. And we're delighted that we also have Marielle Gray coming from North America. So it's very early in the morning for Mary. Thank you for getting up at this very early time. I hope you have some coffee going over there. And Mary is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft, is also a faculty fellow at Harvard. And from this perspective, she wears two kinds of hats. She's actually in the tech world and she is in the academic world. And in fact, she's actually writing a book right now. She's taking off some time for her writing, as I understand right now. I just wanted to say that what's interesting, I'm looking for the book title here because I put it on a very small text. Okay. Mary, you did a book that came out last year on ghost workers, okay? And what was interesting about that book is you started saying that Silicon Valley is creating a new global underclass of gig workers, basically, that are hidden away in the recesses of Silicon Valley. And that's leading you directly to your next book, which you're trying to get out by the end of this year, called The Mentality of Big Tech, How Scaling Fast Fails Society and What We Could Do Instead. So I know you're going to have a lot to say about that also. So thank you very much. So right now I'm going to pause our sharing here. And Caroline, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session on a subject that obviously, and I'm going to say it from the start, I'm not a specialist. I have a lot of people that are much more specialist on data and data's usage. But I would say that in my two jobs, as you say, Michael, I had to understand exactly what we are going to do with this data. And also what kind of regulation we have to take into account. So maybe a few comments. The first one is, as you said, banking. The banking sector is an over-regulated sector, and good reasons for that. And I think that one element that we need to keep into our mind before discussing data is the notion of trust. And the reason why we are so much concerned about the usage and what we're going to be doing with data in banking is certainly because we had to suffer from the lack of trust right after the financial crisis. So we are now in a sector where compliance, and I will, of course, talk a little bit about compliance and ethics, but compliance is the rule in our everyday work in the banking sector. At the same time that we had to deal with the lack of trust right after the financial crisis, we are undergoing a major digital transformation. And we consider ourselves as a data-driven company now, which is not what, the description I would have done maybe 10 years ago. Having that in mind, I think that what we consider as being at the core of our business is how we're going to be using data in order to improve the relation we have with our employees, with our customers, and with the rest of our stakeholders. Having said that, we have put in place, and maybe we are, I don't know how other companies are, but in Société Générale, we have put in place a governance related to data that is going very far. First, because we had to deal with GDPR, obviously regulation, and it had a huge impact on our company and the way we are dealing with data and data privacy. And second is because we really believe that we can use the data to improve the customer experience and also the way we interact with our employees. But in that, we had to deal with, obviously, not only the compliance issue, so the legal issue linked to the data usage. And I will not go too much into details, but obviously we have a very strict governance on how we store, how we use the governance. And I know we will be discussing the 5 Ps, but obviously GDPR is requiring us to really look at what kind of data we are using, how we are using it, and obviously how we are storing it. But the second element that was much more interesting is the fact that a few years ago, we put in place a committee that actually, with businesses around the table, obviously the DPO, people really into IT, a designer of products, and the HR, obviously, and comms. And we spent many sessions thinking about what our convictions are around the usage of data, the ethics, but also the artificial intelligence. Because we know already from the way we are using the data that what we are trying to do is, once again, is improve the way we interact with our employees and with our customers. And the ideas around these sessions were really to be able to write 2 documents. The first one was a data charter that is published now. It's available on our internet site. And the idea was really to tell our stakeholders what exactly we are doing with the data that we're collecting. Because, for example, for compliance issue, we are collecting a lot of data. I mean, we have what we call the KYC, know your customers, in our environment. And this is when we onboard customers from the start. We are collecting a number of data. And this number of data is obviously required by the compliance officer, but also from the regulators. And every time we are using this type of data, I'm not going to get into the consent issue, but obviously yes, I will post the link to the data charter. I see the comment. And this is really, for me, a document that is extremely important because it, at the same time, raise the awareness of our stakeholders on the usage of data. And it's also a way for us to give our convictions. And the second element that we decided to work on is 10 principles for trustworthy artificial intelligence. This is a very heavy document. It's not yet finalized, so I cannot give it to you, but it's a very detailed document on which we explain what we believe are the key success factors for ethics in data usage. For example, the fact of having always supervision of human from the different moment we're using artificial intelligence, or how do we secure and protect the data that we collect with cyber resilience, for example, elements, or how do we make sure that we don't create bias in the way we use artificial intelligence, and how do we avoid having, for example, you remember discrimination in the way we're going to be using artificial intelligence for recruiting, for example, and so on. And this has created a moment, and I'm a strong believer that putting together around the table all of the stakeholders has really raised the awareness at the highest level of the organization, and also, and more specifically, in the IT part of the organization, because IT is very pushy on going even further on the usage of data, but preventing actually bias or harms that can be done to some of the stakeholders. Maybe I'm going to stop there, Michael, so that we have time for more discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. Karosh, do you want to take up the baton, so to speak?
Yeah, with pleasure. So, when it comes to digital, then, I can tell this from my own story. This has become a massive booster for our business. And that's actually one reason why I got to digital ethics. Let me give you a little bit of context. I'm actually responsible for our industrial adhesive business called Loctite. This is like the typical bottle you would see to make it a little bit tangible. And we help customers to produce airplanes, to produce smartphones, or what you see in my background is, to help them with our maintenance solutions to fix their factories, and with that also, avoid downtime and things like that. Now, saying that, digital in the last 3 years was a massive reason why we could actually double the growth in our new applications. So we did double the growth by using the data from 300,000 customer visits my team is doing per year, 40,000 projects we're closing every year. And this data, processing it, allowed us actually to get insights in how to better micro-target and to better prioritize what we call hero applications, customer hero applications. So you see, I'm actually coming to an angle to this topic, digital ethics, from it's a booster digital for our business. And what I want to avoid is that the booster becomes also a booster multiplying our risks. Yeah, so we don't want to, we want to have the good part without the bad part. And if you see in my background, if you can read it, but you see the pods, we're actually now going we just commercialized it last year to make the adhesive itself intelligent, so it becomes IoT, and then you can do the maintenance work, actually predict it and prescribe it with a subscription model based condition monitoring, all that. And here we will collect even more data, right? So that's where the risk exposure will become also bigger, along with the bigger opportunities. And that's why we started, to upskill our 2,500 people very early on. It helped us also to become more inclusive and all talking to each other, driving transformation in digital. But very specifically for those most exposed, we installed mandatory trainings on how to use data, similar to what Caroline was saying. So as a company, now we took even a step further, that we installed in our new code of conduct a whole new chapter on digital safety and ethics. And, obviously as a traditional company with 140 years, as Michael Michael said, we are late in the game of digital transformation compared to tech companies or financials. However, what we did is to apply the same principle of integrity for what we're operating in the normal world, also to the digital world. And this specifically means to educate the people who are exposed with mandatory trainings on, data transparency, when it comes to artificial intelligence, that we have a clear governance process to approve these artificial intelligence using, for instance, then for Loctite pulse. And what we installed is, as a governance, we leverage our compliance structure. And at Henkel, the compliance structure is not only working on the regulatory compliance, is actually much more normative. So you're giving direction, like saying the same level of integrity that you're applying in the normal world, you need to apply to the digital world. And this is where we are now at this point. So the entire 50,000 people at Henkel are actually committed to now do the same level of compliance that they conduct to the normal world, also to the digital world. So that's, to give some different angle, why actually digital ethics is becoming important to me is because it's a massive growth driver, and I want to make sure it's sustainable and it doesn't come with this risk multiplication.
Great, thank you very much, Karosh. So let's turn over to Mary. Mary at Microsoft actually created its own institutional review board several years ago. It's a leader in this area. And Mary has been doing lots of work and research in this area. Mary, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm obsessed with this topic, so it's really it's wonderful to hear the different perspectives and that you're thinking about this as business leaders. I think that's a really critical point I wanted to make. So I chair our ethics review program inside of Microsoft Research, which is effectively the research and development branch of Microsoft. Every tech company has a fairly sophisticated research and development facet. We are fairly unique in that our research and development arm is almost firewalled from product development. So we are brought in from academe. We often have scholars who are considered a decade ahead of the state of the art as it's practiced in business settings. So I like to think, I hope that our awareness of the fragility of the trust that Caroline referenced and the importance of really taking seriously integrity, as Koresh, you just mentioned, that's core to all business. That's core to anyone who lays claim to the value of data. So I'm saying that because several years ago, Microsoft Research, a number of us inside the research arm, created the ethics review program modeled on institutional review boards in academic settings. Mm-hmm. Why did we do this? Primarily because, as many of you know, if you're interacting with people or people's data, that calls upon you as a researcher in an academic environment to care more and to care differently. I actually wouldn't say more, but to have a different responsibility to society than private enterprise. GDPR is a game changer because it argues we all share a responsibility to society. And I wanted to just take a step back and really have us think about what is data. When we use that term, I think we often are assuming it just exists in the world. And that's one frame, but it's generated through our individual interactions with technologies and each other. Like right now, we're having an interaction that's generating data. So we sometimes call this the exhaust or the oil of the Internet of Things, or using technologies. I prefer to frame it to keep us aware of what are we handling as the traces of our personal and social interactions often with each other. These are the that changes how we think about our responsibilities to consumers, employees, and society as businesses. If we think about we are stewards of a social environment, not stuff, not flat files, not numbers on a spreadsheet, but quite literally often in real time, people's experience of the world, because so many people are experiencing the world through their mobile devices, and often they aren't aware of how much they're moving through a world of Internet of Things. That's a really critical piece of this. People have, I don't mean this in an inflammatory way. They have no idea how much data is being collected about what they're doing. And most importantly, computer science and engineering drive digital transformation and AI and development. So computing research, specifically computer science engineering, their attitudes and their people trained to handle data, but also to produce data, to collect it, to store it, to analyze it. They're integral to business operations now. Those disciplines approach data from a perspective of security and privacy. The establishment of security and privacy as kind of foundational ethical tenets. And I think, as Michael said earlier, those aren't actually ethical tenets. They're a way of conceptualizing, protecting, and defending data points. That framing started in really the 1970s. There has been no update to the considerations of computer science engineering driving digital transformation adopted by business since the 1970s. So we still are obsessed with protecting and defending data. We haven't yet shifted within technology companies to a way of thinking. We're interacting with humanity. We're interacting with the social world. I think I love hearing Koresh say, and Caroline as well, you're going back to what are fundamentals. If you're in financial services, you absolutely get the priority of protecting, but also seeing as sensitive anything that you're collecting or working with. But with a sensitivity of that's a very intimate detail about somebody's life. So that, the fracturing of trust isn't just a fracturing of a consumer using a product. It's will they trust banking? So, carrying the weight of that on our shoulders is important. And the point I wanted to start at was that we are drawing from a well from computer science and engineering and pulling it through our uses of data that have not yet contended with what are we doing here when we're working with data. I would argue we are deeply engaged with people in society, and we are at the very beginning of incredibly valuable, again, as both the previous speakers noted, incredibly valuable opportunities to learn about our world and each other. But we have approached it without the framing of care and consideration of a kind of social accountability. So let me finish as quickly as possible to say that means we have an opportunity to think about not just the principles, right now, principles around transparency, accountability, questions around bias. That's an incredibly important development within the tech industry, and I think any company that considers itself moving through a digital transformation or part of that transformation, they're picking up the mantle of those principles. Microsoft has been at the forefront of establishing them. Inside Microsoft Research, we actually argue that's basic. That's not enough. And in fact, how do you practice that? Because even the top-heavy management reporting, I don't know who I'd report to, it's the bench data scientist. It's the bench user of an out-of-the-box AI approach that has to evaluate, how do I practice integrity? How do I practice keeping trust? And I want to recommend something from a National Academy study that I was a part of in the United States, where we put together a panel of computer scientists and engineering and social scientists and legal experts to have a conversation about what should be our new approach to practicing ethics beyond security and privacy. And the three conclusions were: to be responsible, computing research would need to expand to include consideration of its ethical but social impact. Upstream at the very beginning, before you build IoT, before you place the sensor, what could be the impact? And really wonderful established processes around this with institutional review boards. What are your risks? What are your benefits?
Yeah.
The second conclusion was you need to engage a full spectrum of stakeholders, as Caroline said. That engagement is critical to understanding the point of view of people who are interacting with your systems and generating data. So you can't assume what does one set of consumers, perhaps low resourced, consider sensitive. And you're ahead of the game in the EU. You actually consider employees and the data they produce something that should be protected. In the United States, if you're an employee generating data, it's owned by your company. So I hope we can all have a conversation about what are the responsibilities of companies across the world to see their employers as a very special category of people generating data that should have a voice in what happens, and in fact, whether data should be collected about them at all, because they have no ability to walk away without losing their livelihood. So I'm hoping to put that on the table as what's actionable here. And then third, there is no world in which managing data can happen without regulation. And I say that because GDPR has been pivotal to the United States tech industry taking seriously that it does have at minimum the responsibility of telling people where did their data go. That should not be the bar. I hope that we can have a conversation about if we're talking about quite literally the fusion and confusion around the putting together of our social and our work lives, our intimate conversations, and generating data through technologies that are helping us every day. Like all of that is piling up because most of the insights and the value of data don't come from the one stream of data you collect. It comes from creating what we call an enhanced data set, where you're getting the information from IoT, but you're cross-referencing it with any sorts of demographic data you have. Those are the places where things become quite sensitive. And I hope we can have more conversation about that. It isn't just a matter of locking up data or de-identifying data. And actually, very importantly, de-identification is not a thing. You cannot divorce any longer someone's activities from their personal identity in any permanent way. We should all leave this seminar knowing that, because we would all proceed very differently if we couldn't assume, it's okay if I use this data because it doesn't actually attach to an individual. Because computer science and engineering 5 years ago came to that conclusion, and the US Census no longer uses de-identification because it's so clear that we no longer have a world in which what we do in the workplace and what we do at home, what we do when we're interacting with the technology, like the one that you have, Koresh, there's no easy way to separate those flows of data. So we have to assume that doesn't matter if you're online or not, we know who you are. So let me stop there. That was a little chilling, but let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's a perfect segue into a discussion about data itself. the focus of our study and the focus of what we want to get across is that we think that companies should set up these digital advisory panels or institutional review boards as they are in universities. But that's a big task. That's not the same as compliance. There's been lots of studies and lots of examples in the world where companies have launched a project using data and artificial intelligence that was compliant with the law, but the outcome was not ethical. And so how do you talk about that? It's hard to talk to a data scientist about ethics because they know about data science. The compliance managers are typically lawyers, and many times they have probably 1 or 2 courses in ethics, but they're trained about the law. So we need a separate panel that has multiple people on it, not just a data guy, not just compliance. Maybe somebody from marketing, maybe somebody from sales, maybe from HR. Other places have to be there. Now, when they're there, what do they discuss? And I think that the big discussion should be this right here, what I call the 5 Ps, a data ethics checklist. First question you have when you're evaluating a project that one of your subordinates wants to do, or one of your colleagues wants to do, is where did the data come from? Where is its provenance? And did you get it legally? Okay, was there appropriate legal consent? Did the suppliers of the data know what it was going to be used for? This is one of the first questions that need to be asked. When you can be assured that you got it legally and you know where it came from, what's the purposing of the data? Was the data repurposed? So, for example, in research in an academic situation, we might collect data. We try to write an academic paper on it. Maybe the data doesn't match what we think are theories. So then we say, okay, we're going to go and look at that data from a different perspective, or from a different theoretical perspective, and do another research on it. There, we're repurposing data we did for one theory for another theory. Now, that data is not human data. When the data is coming from humans, you have to ask the question, if I repurpose that data that was collected from humans, would they be in agreement with that? If they're not, then you have an ethical problem. Then, of course, you've got the issue of protecting the data. This is pretty much what people think about when they call data protection. Is it protected in terms of who can access it? It can't get lost. That you have it when appropriate or when necessary, you have it anonymized. And then somewhere along the line, who is in charge with actually erasing the data? Because data sets can have a limited lifespan in many cases. And somebody's got to be responsible for all copies of the data set, and does it get deleted at the proper time? Now, once you have data, and Caroline and I talked a lot about this, the processing of the data. I worked with a company called Cornerstone. It's a human resource services company that provides training and career and management for companies around the world. They have 2,500 clients, more or less. They're operating in dozens of countries. And so I was analyzing the data that they provided for me from 10 years, 10 companies, 10 countries with 2,500 plus companies. That gave me about 1 billion observations. And so those observations were horrendous to have to clean. For example, what if you want to talk about the gender of somebody? What do? You say M for male, F for female, H for homme, French, F for femme. Do you write it out? Man, woman, chico, chica. I mean, the data we had, there are 55 or 60 different ways of having that data listed. If I want to merge all that data together and I don't have the same identical, way of identifying gender, then it's junk, garbage in, garbage out. It's not useful at all. So that's got to be really important. What do you do with missing cases? That's a little bit of an academic question, but if you're trying to come up with a bank score, creditworthiness, how long to sentence somebody to jail, and you don't have all the data in there in your big data set that you're using to train your algorithm, you could come out with completely wrong responses. So super critical. And then finally, the procedure. What kind of analysis are you doing? If you're using regression or classification, these are pretty standard tools. Many people understand them. University people have generally taken a course in it. But if you're going into machine learning, you say, is your machine learning supervised or unsupervised? If you don't know what that means you shouldn't be involved in doing this at that particular time. Are you going to use neural networks? I think maybe only 100 people in the world really understand how neural networks work. And it's increasingly a promising area of research. So what kind of tools you're using need to be clear, be able to understand the outcome of that, be able to explain to a CEO, to a journalist, to your stakeholders, to the customers themselves, what it means. So these are the five, we call the 5 Ps, the 5 data ethic checklists that you want to take a look at. So I'm going to turn it back over to our guest. Maybe they have some, I'll leave the screen on there. Do you have examples of any of these that you think would be nice to share with our participants? Karosh, do you want to start out?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I think I very much appreciate this practical, checklist with the 5 Ps, because it makes it tangible and memorable. And I, as a takeaway of this, panel, I hope the participants can take this with them, because let me start with a couple of practical examples. So, Mary was elaborating on, we don't know, or most of the people don't know how the data is actually, how much data is collected. In the real world, you sign, never a paper contract without having read it, right? So I think none of us did this, but you constantly do it every day almost when you use your smartphone, right? So this is a no-go. And I think, these 5 Ps very tangibly make it clear that you become aware of basics like that, but also very specifically, if I go back to the example that I mentioned, where we are processing 300,000 customer visit data points that we have, we connect these data points with our market model that has 30 million data sets. Obviously, there is a lot of sensitive information there. To make conclusions like the ones we are using to prioritize, and with this double our close projects within 3 years, we did need to connect the dots. And this has to be in a way that those people exposed to the data are aware, if it is sensitive data, they really need to protect the data. So how do we do that practically when we talk about provenance, purposing, but then also protecting processing and procedure? So we have a clear, mandatory trainings these people need to do that have exposure to this sensitive information. We take also, the repurposing as an example. We make sure that none of the data is repurposed without consent of the original person when we basically start to analyze the data. We break the data into pieces. I think this hopefully will, with the blockchain technology, be probably one of the things that help us in the future. We only give, based on need to know principle, the data to people that are processing the data, so that they don't have the full picture. I think, this helps a lot. And let me close with one last statement. Mary was saying, that it goes far beyond legal compliance. It is actually the future of society. And I can tell you, I was, just recently in Silicon Valley, and I did visit in Santa Clara, where most of those companies are, some of them corporate members, but I also visited CPs. And I was very positively surprised, because I did pay attention specifically to digital ethics, that it's not anymore the world of what Facebook was calling move fast, break things. That is, I didn't perceive that. It confirmed what I also see in the interactions overall, that they're much more conscious about what's going on in the world and their responsibility, for society far beyond just making business. Yeah, and this is, I think, the ask to us here in the SEMS community. We have, actually 16,000 alumni with 111 nationalities. So we should actually create here impact by upskilling the people and making digital ethics really a priority. So back to you, Michael.
Well, that's it. Carolyn, you told me a few interesting stories. Do you want to?
Yes, sure. First, let me just come back on what Mary was talking about, and just remind everyone, and especially for those that are not in Europe, how GDPR has been extremely a huge game changer. I mean, it's really something that created a big shock in companies. I mean, it's very heavy to implement. It had taken us something like 3 years in order to put that in place. And talking about the 5 Ps, I mean, it has a huge impact on most of these 5 Ps that are, as you said, very important. And sometimes, by the way, it created a little bit of bureaucracy, because it's very, very heavy processes at every stage of the data lifecycle. It's very important. It's the basic for going to ethical behaviors. I'm a strong believer in that, but we need to understand that it had huge impact, and it created also, and this is very positive, a lot of training. We had to train every single employees in this group on how to use data. So maybe coming back on the 5 Ps, and just maybe taking a small focus on 2, which is purposing and protecting. As I said, and because of GDPR anyway, the consent is required when you are asking for data in our company. But on repurposing, for example, we have put in place a huge governance under the supervision of Group Data Office, and we are basically looking at the total life cycle of the data, from the creation to the moment it's being deleted, because you know that in GDPR we need to delete each data at a certain time, and there are actually a life cycle for each type of data. And maybe on the protection, that's something that I wanted to talk about, is the fact that we have put in place, we have developed actually a tool that is called DataGo, in order to make sure that any data scientists that want to use the data for any type of given purpose has actually to enter this tool, and it has to really make sure and document any type of usage that it wants to do with this set of data. And as I was explaining to you, Michael, at some point, I had the idea of, we have in banking what we call the inspection. Inspection is this part of the organization that audits basically everything that's going on in the company. And they have actually full access to email, for example, when they are investigating a fraud or investigating something that may have happened in the company. They have access to all the data at some given time in order to make their investigation. And it is, of course, supervised by the regulator. And having this access, they actually, there's something that I'm very conscious about, is misbehaviors. We would love to have the capacity to see or to be aware of any type of management misbehaviors we may have in the company. And when you have access to this email, obviously, you can see weak signal, like, the way the person would talk, would write to colleagues or something, would actually induce the capacity to see or to prevent misbehavior. So we had this idea at some point and say, well, we should ask the inspection to not only look for the fraud or whatever is investigating into, but also at the same time being able to see if in the way the emails are written, it could, see in advance some type of misbehaviors. And, at the moment we ask for the permission and you would say, oh, that was a nice, objectives. I mean, it was a very positive objective because the idea was really to look with this data. So the usage of the data was to look into a fraud. And the fact of asking to use this data for another type of purpose, even though the purpose was a noble one, was forbidden. Yeah. So we had to stop the pilot that we wanted to do, just because we were about to use this data for a purpose that was not accepted by the regulator. And that's how, putting the 5 Ps, and I'm not going to go into the other ones, but putting these 5 Ps that are the basic also of GDPR and of a compliance, let's say, usage of data, is actually preventing you from doing something that may not be ethical, because in my case, it was, of course, a noble cause, but in some other case, it could have led to some not that noble cause.
Caroline, let me just jump in really quickly here, and then I turn over to Mary. When the participants signed up, registered for this webinar, you put in your name, you put in your email address, you gave a few little details about where your country, what industry you're working in, what your level in the firm, and things like that. And on Monday, I was talking with Karosh. We had a Zoom link to discuss our slides, and he said, "Well, who's our audience?" And I said, "Oh yeah, well, we have a nice audience here. Here, I'll send you the Excel file with our audience." He said, "Wait a second, is that ethical to share that with me? Because I would be giving name and email addresses." So I said, "Hey, you're right. Maybe that's not actually ethical." So I shared it, but I just took out the names and the email addresses, so all he saw were the profile. But then I checked on our registration site, and our registration site, there's a disclaimer saying that this data will be shared with the host and will be used according to the policies of HEC Paris. Now, does that mean I'm the host so I can see it? I have guests. Are the guest host also? Can I share it with them? Just a little wording creates a little bit of a question mark on that. And this is how banal it can actually be. If you didn't really put the wording in correctly, can you share it or not? Now, I'm sure most of you probably didn't worry about that, but that shows the level of what companies have to worry about, it seems to me.
But may Michael say something on that, because that's exactly the type of discussion we have all day long in our company. And if I take this list and I send them an offer for a banking offer for Société Générale, that wouldn't be ethical, obviously, and I would actually not be using the data in the right way. And I would say sometimes that's why I was saying it's going very, very far, because basically today it kind of freezing a little bit the innovation capacity sometimes. I mean, we need to know that. And it's once again, it's normal, and it's GDPR, and it's also the ethical way of looking at data. But it's going so far that it's creating a huge amount of work for every single person in companies using data today.
We're just at about 2 minutes to go. Mary, can I turn it over to you for 1 minute?
And cut me off at 1 minute, because I would say we are at the very beginning of having to think about what do we want to do here as parts of business, as citizens. And I think that's the most important takeaway is it's a burden now. And I think that's the toughest thing is regulation was a very heavy hammer and it was not a scalpel delicately cutting through what needed to be cut through. It was the first move. And I think it was a telling move. It was a reaction to the general public having no sense of understanding of what is happening here. And frankly, and bluntly, it is on technologists that sell technologies to any company to be able to build technologies that are from the beginning designed with the practice of reflection on what are my responsibilities to society. De-identification, again, is something that is so temporary. We have to be approaching what we're doing here as sacrosanct. We're holding the ability to identify any person and their actions. And more importantly, because artificial intelligence is about modeling, we're holding the ability to presume what somebody like me might or might not want or do, and cutting them off from what they may or may not receive as a benefit from a company. So that's the charge here, is to realize we do have a heavy responsibility. And I think you should put it on tech companies that you're working with for digital transformation, but also, you know, it's on all of us. Maybe I'm wanting to hold more of that responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's just show a few takeaways that we would like to share with you in our study here. Compliance review is not an ethics review. So if you're a company, you're going to be putting this together, don't just say, okay, we're going to give the ethical review to the compliance manager. It's two separate things, okay? Your compliance manager has got to be part of the committee, but it shouldn't be just assigned to a compliance manager by itself. As Karosh said, Silicon Valley tech companies were some of the most proactive, but they got into the game many years ago. And then they began to see the problems occurring. Finance and banking, in Caroline's case, it's just a basic requirement, you know, in order to, you know, take care of your customers. And then other firms like Henkel and Siemens and many of the big companies are beginning to see that data is going to be useful, and they've seen the mistakes made in the past. And so they're at the same time trying to find the best way to use the data and use it in a way that's correct. So that means that any digital transformation must be broadly defined. It's just not linking everything to the internet. It's just not doing a digital twin. It's really trying to define the entire field at the same time, which means that ethical review is an integral part of this transformation. And we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about this, but there are a lot of very advanced tools out there, and it's like a wild west on using those tools. They're not being very well controlled. And so we sort of like the expression, tame the tools, okay? Make sure that you're using them correctly and that they're adding value for your firm rather than opening you up to potential risk. And with that, there was one other question about that I'll answer very quickly here, about whether or not policymakers around the world are currently protecting digital ethics. How advanced are they? I don't think they're very advanced at all. I don't think it's many of them, there's discussions about them, but we still need to go much farther from that perspective. Okay, that's near the end. Let us make a couple of thanks. First, if you want to contact any of us, I'm sure you can connect with us on LinkedIn. If you have additional questions, we'd be happy to help out. And got that for you. I'll do that right there. And just a few people to thank. Really like to thank the SEMS and HEC Paris communications, alumni relations, the IT teams, Nicole Desfontaines, who's the SEMS executive director. They really helped us create this study and put this before your eyes. Many, many SEMS HEC students, LSC alumni completed the ethics survey. We really thank you for doing that. We had very good response rate on that. So thanks to you for offering that to us. Special thanks go to Professor Whiteley at the London School of Economics for his advice in this area. London School of Economics has a very sophisticated IRB policy procedure online. It does an excellent job. It'd be nice to duplicate that in other places. I'd like to thank Martin Hill, who's at St. Gallen, the University of St. Gallen, for supporting us. He's the founder of the International Board Foundation, so he gave us lots of support. And finally, all of you, we really thank you for joining us today. And any last minute comments from Karosh, Caroline, or Mary before we turn them loose for lunch?
So glad people came.
Okay. Yeah. It's always nice when you have a bigger audience and you have a panel, right? Okay.
And we're just at the start, right? As we said.
What's that?
It's just the start. We're just at the start. I think we need to see this just as an ignition, of the story when it comes to SEMS. I put here on my SEMS strategic board member, I think we need to upskill our SEMS students so that they are digitally savvy, and specifically also ethics.
That's good. I teach a course in digital ethics and ethical algorithm development at HEC, okay, the last 3 years in the MBA program. We should expand that everywhere in the world. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. I thank the panelists for coming on, particularly Mary for getting up in the middle of the night over there to join us. And we wish you all a great day today and a great weekend coming up, and a good digital ethic review process at your own companies. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.